Okay, everyone, good evening, and welcome to our webinar on avian influenza. And again, my name is Jeff Wenzel. I'll be your moderator tonight, and I see there's questions already coming up, and we'll get to those and send you those messages. And again, this session is being recorded, and it will be posted. And Heather's going to put the website on biosecurity website, and we'll put that address up for everybody. So we have three speakers lined up tonight to tell you about the current situation and issues around avian influenza. With us tonight is Dr. Wilma Schenkels. Wilma is the Chief Veterinary Officer for the Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture. We also have Dr. Cynthia Philippe, who is with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and will be bringing an update from CFII. And our last speaker of the evening will be Heather McLean, who is the non-ruminant specialist looking after mink, chicken, and pork with Perennia, and she'll be bringing the session home on biosecurity.
I'm just going to go through the current avian influenza situation with you guys. So avian influenza is a viral infection that affects wild birds and domestic poultry. The avian influenzas are generally divided into two categories: the low pathogenic avian influenzas, which are often cause no symptoms or mild disease, and the highly pathogenic avian influenzas, which cause more severe signs and symptoms and often high mortalities. The virus that is currently circulating is a highly pathogenic avian influenza. And wild birds, particularly waterfowl, are natural reservoirs of the disease, and they often can carry the disease without showing any signs or symptoms. They can pass it to other birds and domestic poultry, and our domestic poultry, especially chickens and turkeys, are more susceptible to the disease and often have high mortality rates. This slide shows us the kind of the current overall worldwide situation, and basically the red dots that we see here are the high pathogenic H5N1 viruses. And it is believed that the H5N1 virus that we're seeing in North America now has crossed the Atlantic from Northern Europe through wild migratory birds. So this slide shows us the map of the wild bird flyways, and there's 4 major flyways in North America. You can see in this slide that those flyways are not distinct. There is some overlap between them, and particularly if you go to the northern parts of the flyways. This overlap in the flyways results in spread of disease between birds between the flyways. So our current strain of high pathogenic avian influenza has been seen in the Atlantic, the Mississippi, and the central flyways. And congregation of birds as they migrate amplifies the virus, and it creates high-risk periods. So we are just kind of getting into those high-risk periods of bird migration. So despite the fact that we have seen some cases of avian influenza to date, a lot of those cases are probably the result of resident waterfowl that have been here, all winter, and we do expect to see increased risk as we see increased migratory birds this spring. The other thing to make note of is with this particular high-path avian influenza virus is behaving a little bit differently than a lot of our former avian influenza viruses. And in Europe, they have seen this virus strain persist at high levels throughout the summer. So we may end up with issues, all summer long with this one. It's really too early to tell, but speaking from the European experience, that is something we are kind of watching closely. So our Canadian high-path avian influenza detections to date in domestic poultry are listed below. Our first one was in December 20th in the Avalon Peninsula in Newfoundland in a small exhibition farm. That was followed in January 9th by an additional small flock in Newfoundland. We saw our first case in Nova Scotia on February 1st in a small flock in eastern Nova Scotia, followed closely by a commercial poultry operation on February 3rd. There was an additional small mixed farm on February 11th in western Nova Scotia, and our final case that we've seen to date, it was in a small flock on March 15th. The virus is currently spreading in Ontario, and there have been 3 cases of commercial poultry flocks in Ontario that have seen this high-path avian influenza virus just in the last few days. So this map kind of shows the Canadian detections of both of high-path avian influenza, both in wild birds and domestic poultry. The green are the domestic poultry, and the other colors are the wild birds. And you can see that there is kind of diverse spread throughout the whole province of avian influenza in wild birds. So I think we have to be wary in all locations. This map gives you a little bit better idea of the North American situation. And, you know, this map is current as of March 27th, but since that date, there has been quite a few additional cases. So avian influenza is spreading quite quickly. You know, it started kind of along the eastern seaboard with these cases in the Atlantic flyway, but it is now spread into the Mississippi and the central flyways. And in the States, there are over 482 wild bird detections, over 80 commercial premises or domestic premises, with over 15 million birds affected at present. So why is avian influenza a concern? Most of the concerns are animal health related, because the virus does cause high death losses in domestic poultry, and that translates into production losses and economic losses. Because avian influenza is considered a foreign animal disease, it does actually trigger trade restrictions with other countries as well, which results in further economic losses for the country. On the human health side, avian influenza is not a food safety risk, but it can be a zoonotic disease. So there is low risk of avian influenza disease in humans, and particularly in humans that are in close contact with sick birds. So it's not recommended to handle birds that are sick. The other risk or the other concern that we have with avian influenza is virus mutations. So sometimes the low pathogenic avian influenza viruses can evolve into highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses. And pigs are also susceptible to avian influenza when in close contact with poultry. And the infected pigs can have the virus mutate and result in new strains of the virus in pigs. So what to do if you see sick or dead birds? So basically in domestic poultry, we want to report those cases to CFII, because it is a reportable disease under the Federal Health of Animal Act. And Dr. Philippe will go through those phone numbers a little bit more with you in her presentation. Also in Nova Scotia, if we see sick or dead wild birds, please don't handle them, but call the Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources and Renewables, that 1-800 number to report those birds.
Thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. Can everybody hear me and see my screen?
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, that's perfect. Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. And as mentioned, so in my portion of this webinar, we will be discussing the disease recognition itself, the risk factors, and also what to expect from the CFII disease response. So let's jump right into it, and about recognizing the disease. And I have 2 take-home messages to begin with. And one is there's no specific signs to the disease itself. There are clinical signs. We will look at them with pictures, but there's nothing that's so specific to the disease. Often, and what we've seen in the cases we have had in Canada is often the first sign is simply a marked sudden increase in mortality. I think it's important also to pay attention to the context. And so there are risk factors that can trigger us to think, hey, this could be highly pathogenic avian influenza. I put a few pictures on the slide. such as the presence of wild birds, wild ducks in this case, in close proximity to barns. Mixed flocks, so the commingling of poultry species that are susceptible, such as chicken and turkeys, with waterfowls who are not typically susceptible in developing the disease. If there is a pond on the property, and wild birds. Okay, so these are also high-risk contexts. So to summarize that piece is, if you have mixed avian species, such as waterfowls on your property, that have outdoor access with a pond on site and wild birds on site, you are at a fairly high risk of your birds becoming in contact with high path AI. We do know that the virus is present in the wild bird population. We're going to go through a series of items to help you assess your risk level on your particular farm. So starting with our migratory waterfowl present in the area. Is there a flock that is confirmed with avian influenza close to your flock? How close is the nearest poultry farm from your farm? How close is your flock to a domestic waterfowl flock? Do you have waterfowl present on your farm? Do you give outdoor access to your birds? And then, going back to the pond, right? So how close are your birds from a pond or a surface water? Do family members or employees have contact with wild waterfowl in activities such as hunting on or near the premises? And then we focus a lot on waterfowls, which we should, because they are the reservoir, but certainly other wild birds are also susceptible. So think also of other type of wild birds, such as starlings. And so you have small wild birds that could enter the barn and eat from the feeders, for example. Continuing, do you have multiple ages of birds present on the farm? Do farm employees have contact with other poultry? I'm thinking of traffic. How many people drove on the farm per week in the past month? Thinking also of deliveries, right? So such as feed deliveries or fuel, are they done by companies that service commercial poultry farms? So are there possible linkages with other poultry farms? What about dead bird disposal? So are the carcasses stored and disposed of, such as through composting or incineration, in close proximity to a barn? And then the bedding material storage area. So are the bedding materials stored in a manner which prevent contamination by wild birds? And in general, what pest control measures are in place? So that completes the list, again, to help you rank your risk level in your particular situation. Next is, we will be looking now at the clinical signs. So we said they're not specific, but there are some we should be looking for. Again, the start might be that the first thing we see is sudden and marked increase in mortality. You may notice a quiet flock and birds that are depressed. If your birds lay eggs, you will likely notice a marked drop in egg production. And the eggs that are produced, many of them will have soft shell or will be shellless. You may notice diarrhea, hemorrhages on the shanks, and then swelling of the skin under the eyes, as well as swelling of the wallows and combs. Now, going through a few pictures, This is a pictures of a lethargic, depressed bird. We said, we will see mortality with this virus, like we definitely see. And there's also diarrhea represented on this picture. Here, representation of the soft shell or shell-less eggs. And then the swollen wattles come and face. And as well as now here, the hemorrhages that may be present on the shank. Okay, so these are, common signs that we may see with avian influenza. So now, when should you notify CFII? So if you suspect Hypatia, because you've seen a few clinical signs, and you may also have number of elements that are considered higher risk, then you should contact CFII. And the same as the previous speaker, Wilma, there's 3 numbers. One for the Nova Scotia outbreak, CFII hotline for the Nova Scotia outbreak, that's functional until the end of April. The Nova Scotia CFII office. And then for outside working hours, there is the permanent CFII hotline for the Atlantic region. Now, CFII, let's pretend CFII has been notified. What can we expect next? Well, first we're going to look at the sequence of events that takes place on the infected premises itself, or on the suspect premises itself. And so once CFII is notified, it triggers a series of action. And the first one may be to collect samples. And so there might already have been samples collected and submitted to a local laboratory. And even if we have preliminary results from a local laboratory, CFII will go on site and collect samples. These samples will be sent to the National Center for Foreign Animal Disease in Winnipeg. This is our national lab. And with this step, we confirm whether or not the flock is positive or negative for avian influenza. At the same time, there will be a premise investigation initiated. So that's a series of questions to gather information on the flock, the risk factors, etc. There will be movement controls placed, such as a quarantine and declaration of infected place. And if the flock is confirmed positive for Hypatia, it will be depopulated. Continuing, after the depopulation comes the disposal. So disposing of dead birds and contaminated materials, such as the bedding, for example, the litter. After that comes the cleaning and disinfection process. Once the cleaning and disinfection is completed and approved, there is a 21-day waiting period, which leads to restocking. Okay. So now now that we've seen the sequence on the infected premises, let's take a look at also what takes place in the area and beyond. So if we go back, okay, while on the infected premises, infected or suspect premises, we have certain steps happening. In parallel, once we have confirmation, there will be an establishment of an avian influenza control zone, which we will describe in a second, as well as a notification of the case to the World Organization for Animal Health, or the OIE. And that may take place before the flock is even depopulated. So let's talk a little bit more about these 2 steps. So first, the notification to the OIE. Canada has an international reporting obligation. So all cases of Hypatia, whether they take place in a commercial flock, in a small flock, in wild birds or other captive birds, these cases must be reported. The OIE has a definition for poultry and non-poultry that has a trade implication. Now, it's important to understand that what we report to the OIE is one thing, and how we respond to the disease in Canada is separate from the reporting. Okay, so continuing on the response now and the control zone. So once we establish an avian influenza control zone, it is made of a 10-kilometer radius around the infected premise. That zone really can be subdivided into 2 subzones. The first one called the infected zone, from 0 to 3 kilometer radius around the infected premise. The movement controls in that zone is a quarantine as well as a declaration of infected place. This applies, and it's important to understand, this applies to all poultry premises that are located in that zone, as well as contact premises. So if there has been exchanges of birds or equipment, for example, with another poultry premise, even if it's outside of that zone, the same movement controls will apply. And then in the 3 to 10 kilometer zone, which is called the restricted zone, there will be requirement to quarantine. And so that applies again to all poultry premises that are identified in that area. This is an example of an avian influenza control zone. This was the first one that was established in Newfoundland in December. So the index or the infected farm is right in the center. If we take the red and orange circle, that constitutes the 0 to 3 kilometer or infected zone. And then if we go from the outer boundary of the orange circle all the way to the end of the green circle, we have the restricted zone, or 3 to 10 kilometer radius. Every dot here represents a poultry premise. Okay. What else happens? Well, there is surveillance activities that take place in the zone, in the avian influenza control zone. There's a number of them, starting with the sick bird calls. And so that's made of a avian influenza information sheet that's handed out with a CFII phone number on it, and a veterinarian that is available to answer the sick bird hotline and fill out a premise investigation questionnaire if need be. In the infected zone only, there will be baseline surveillance. So as these premises are identified, there are samples collected and tested to ensure or to confirm the status, positive or negative, of avian influenza on that particular premises. Then in both the infected zone and restricted zone, we have dead bird surveillance as well as the flock health check. Dead bird surveillance consists of swabbing of randomly selected 5 dead birds for every barn, twice a week in the infected zone or weekly in the restricted zone. The flock health checks, they're done weekly, and it's information on mortality rate, egg production rate, feed consumption, water consumption, to make sure there's no change in the health status of the flock. If there are movements of birds or bird product like eggs, for example, that need to happen, there is testing surveillance that is done prior to that. And finally, before releasing the quarantine or removing the movement controls, there's also a quarantine release surveillance. A little bit more information on the release of movement controls. So that can start 21 days after the disposal of infected birds. Okay. On the infected premises itself, the movement controls can be released once the cleaning disinfection is completed and approved, and then there is a 21-day waiting period. And at that point, the case can be closed with the OIE. For all the other premises in the avian influenza control zone, and the movement controls can be released for the premises in the infected zone, we need all the surveillance test results to be negative, as well as there is the quarantine release testing that must be negative. In the restricted zone, we rely simply on the continued negative surveillance result in the zone. So this completes the overview of the CFII disease response.
So welcome everybody. There is going to be a bit of an overlap with some of what Dr. Schenkels and Dr. Philippe talked about, but that's really because you know, it just shows the importance behind some of the biosecurity and where some of the risk lies, and how important it is to be aware of what those things are and to be able to make decisions based on that. So we're here tonight to talk primarily about avian influenza. It's sort of the topic of the day. But there is a lot of other diseases that you can prevent spreading by implementing good biosecurity on your farm and for your flock. So while you'll benefit from helping to protect yourself somewhat from avian influenza, there are lots of other things that, you know, think about things like ILT and other viruses, many other bacteria. And so good biosecurity can really help to protect from spreading those around as well. These diseases, you know, they impact welfare. They can impact, you know, if you do have a production flock, if you do happen to produce meat or eggs, then you know, it impacts the production and the profitability of those flocks. It is really important to understand how disease spreads and how to prevent it, and that good biosecurity really truly reduces your risk on that. The basic principles of biosecurity is essentially prevention, so keeping things out of your farm, out of your barn, and away from your flock, but also containment. So it's keeping it in if you do happen to get something, and so not spreading it to potentially other flocks on your farm or to other places. And you know, if you do get something and you think there's something amiss, you know, containment would be a self-imposed isolation. So you basically lock yourself down. And you know, in a situation with avian influenza, you know, the biosecurity practices that go into place are essentially to shut the virus down so it doesn't spread and the impact is reduced on a larger extent. What that looks like as far as biosecurity from property to property, it's going to look different from farm to farm or even flock to flock. All of your setups are a little bit different. Your properties are a little bit different. You know, your flock makeup is a little different. And so there'll be some variability as to how you implement biosecurity. So the big thing is that you think about first is, how is disease spread? It's hard to prevent it if you don't truly see how it might be spread. It is a little bit difficult to, you know, it's invisible to the naked eye, so you can't see it. So you're not aware when it is being spread. A drop of water or a speck of dust can contain enormous numbers of virus or bacteria, and it may only need a few to be infective. Some can live for a very long time in the environment and tend to be temperature and time dependent. So something like avian influenza, for example, it survives very well in the cold. As it gets warmer, its survive time is a little less. And so how long it survives is going to be temperature dependent and environment dependent. It makes it a little bit hard when we get asked questions on, you know, how long will it be on the ground outside if there is AI in a manure from a duck that's flown overhead. That's a super hard question to answer because it is so dependent on that temperature, and so the time is going to depend. Diseases spread in a number of different ways, and I've got a couple of lists here, and then I am going to, on the following slides, I'll go through in a little more detail on some of these things. So pests and rodents and other animals, wild birds, bringing in new birds into your flock is a huge risk. The carcasses of dead birds, so your mortality management, airborne particles or dust. People, so we are one of the biggest risks to our flocks and the flocks around us. Our clothing, our shoes, hair of ourselves, our visitors, our employees, as they move from farm to farm or even between areas on our property. And I have a note there, you know, if you're a waterfowl hunter, you hunt ducks or geese, be careful because you are dealing with waterfowl at that point and you can never be sure what you're bringing back to the farm. Contaminated feed, water, bedding, equipment, and vehicles. So people and equipment. I started with this one because it's kind of one of the big red flags. Entering the area where the live birds are is your highest risk. You know, it's highly recommended that you wash hands with soap and water and apply hand sanitizer both before you handle those birds and after. So again, it's the don't bring anything in, but also don't bring anything back out again. Other things that you might bring into where the birds are, so things like, you know, if you're recording information, so pens, computers, or scales. If you have a bucket that you're bringing feed in and you sit it down inside or outside, you know, sanitize the bottom of that. You know, sort of think about where have the things that I'm bringing into the pen been, and do they present a risk? It's always best if you can have dedicated equipment for each of your individual flocks, but that's not always going to be practical. You know, you are going to share things from flock to flock, or potentially even from farm to farm. So if that's the case, then just be sure to disinfect it when you're done. Signage is always highly recommended so that people know that this is an area where your birds are, that you don't want people to just wander into, that it is a restricted access and they shouldn't be going in without you knowing and without the proper protocols in place. So signage, locked doors if possible. Again, in a lot of backyard flocks, that's not a possibility. But don't assume that visitors that come onto your property are going to see your signs, or that they're necessarily going to respect them. You know, you see people sort of, they come along, they look at a sign, go, oh, that's a stop sign, and then they walk right by it. Or even that they're going to know what to do. So yes, you've told someone they can go in and you know, they're feeding your birds for you. They've gone in to see something that you have. They won't know what your biosecurity protocols are, or necessarily kind of understand what to do when they get there. So make sure that you share that with them. Clothing and footwear is a big way that we can help protect our flocks, just to ensure that we are clean when we go into a flock, and we're not bringing anything back out again. So, you know, wear dedicated clothing or coveralls to tend to your birds. So a clothing change or cover up with coveralls. Have coveralls for people who come visit your birds so that they have clean clothes or clean coveralls on. Have dedicated footwear for each barn that you're tending to. If you don't have clean footwear for each barn and you're going into the pens, you can use disposable boots and supply boots or disposable boots for visitors. I do have on the screen there just a couple of examples. I guess those are all sort of the clear booties. You can get blue ones with elastics around them. There's a number of different types available. Just be a little bit careful. They're not bulletproof, and you know, walking across gravel or rougher ground or using them for a period of time, they can wear through. And as well, if you happen to have people who are using them and it's you know, it's wintertime, you know, we all know the ice and the snow that can show up in our yards. Those simply aren't safe to cross a yard with. You know, you can end up falling and somebody can hurt themselves pretty easily. So, you know, at that point, it's a case of, you know, put your boot on as you step into the pen, and then you're not as much risk for falling. Again, the dedicated footwear, I repeat it because it's a pretty important piece. Your feet are one of the biggest risks because you do pick up a lot of debris on them outside. When you clean your boots, be careful you're not disinfecting the dirt on your boots. You can't disinfect inside dirt. So clean them first, scrub them down, and then disinfect them. I do want to touch on boot dips and mats for just a second. It used to be in the past, we'd always recommend, you know, absolutely have a boot dip, make sure you step in it, but they're only as good as they're maintained. If a boot dip looks like the ones that are kind of on the bottom there, it's not helping your biosecurity at all. Boot dips need to be regularly maintained and cleaned, or honestly, they're not worth having. I've stepped over my fair share of boot dips because it was dirtier to step in it than it was to just carry on. So again, I just want to touch on this. This isn't going to be possible in all of your scenarios. You do need a little bit of space to be able to do it, but it's a good practice, and it's a good theory to kind of keep in mind and see if there's a way that you can kind of work this into your scenario. It's called the Danish entry system, and it's essentially it's a dirty side and a clean side. And so there's a line of separation, a physical barrier, maybe a bench. Some places have a line across the floor. That's probably not quite as good, but some sort of physical barrier that all of the dirty things, such as your boots, stay on one side, and then you slide over to the other side. You can change your boots, put clean coveralls on, and that side is clean before you enter the pen. Just a few other recommendations on keeping disease out. It's generally recommended that a flock be all in and all out. And so you're bringing birds of all the same ages in. They're all coming into the pen at the same time, and they're all leaving at the same time. You clean and disinfect your pens and your equipment, preferably after each flock, or at least yearly. Don't mix birds. So mixing ages tends to increase your risk, and increasing species. So if, again, goes back to the question we had earlier, if you have ducks and geese, it's not recommended that you mix those with your chickens, because that does increase the risk. Don't forget about your vehicles. The picture there is spraying down of the wheel wells. If you're driving through a yard, that's where the splatter is really going to occur. But also think about the inside of your vehicles. So if you have a farm truck that you know that it tends to get a little bit dirtier, think about wiping down the steering wheel and making sure that that's kept clean. And sort of a last on this slide, but definitely not least, especially at this time, it's not recommended that you feed wild birds. That's drawing wild birds to your property and increasing the chance that you're bringing wild birds that might be infected onto your property. Just one really quick note about disinfectants. We talk a lot about, make sure you disinfect your equipment, you disinfect your shoes, your pen, but make sure that it's actually targeting what you're intending. If you're disinfecting for, say you're concerned about something like avian influenza, make sure you're using a virucidal disinfectant. Read the labels so that you know how to mix it, and they all have different instructions to make sure that you're using it properly. And remember again that you can't disinfect dirt, so clean what you're disinfecting before you actually disinfect it. If you're disinfecting a pen, you're looking at a dry clean. Wash it down with detergent to break down those biofilms and the greases that get on the surface. Rinse it, dry it, and then disinfect it. And you dry it before disinfecting so that you're not actually diluting your disinfectant. And then let it dry and let it have a little bit of downtime. So if you're disinfecting your pen, your feeders, your drinkers, equipment, just make sure that you're using the right disinfectants and you're following the label instructions on that. Pests, rodents, and other animals. Everybody's headache, especially as we get into the time of year, they're probably increasing in numbers. Fall is probably the worst time to start seeing them in your pens. But definitely we've all had our headaches with rodents and pests of all sorts. Know which pest you're dealing with, because if you don't know which one you're dealing with, it's a little bit harder to attack it and to figure out how you're going to deal with it, because you're not sure how it lives and what its habits are. Have a rodent control program, use bait stations, traps, manage it properly. Keep feed covered up and clean up the spills in a timely manner so that you're not actually attracting them and feeding them. And the same with things like with water, and just to ensure that you're not drawing them to you. Keep vegetation, weeds, and tall grass and debris minimized, so you're not giving them a safe spot to stay. And the bottom, one of those photos there at, the other animals, a lot of times we'll let our dogs into our pens. There'll be cats around that we're using for rodent control. Just be very cautious about that, because they can actually, they don't dip their feet real well. We can actually be carrying in disease on our pets if we're letting them come into our pen. Bringing new stock into an existing flock is always a big risk for disease introduction. Know the disease status of the flock you're bringing in, but realize that just because you know the disease status of them doesn't mean there's not still a risk. The lowest risk is going to be if you're bringing eggs into your property and you're hatching them yourself. The next lowest risk would be bringing chicks or poults in and then raising them. And then the older birds, because they've been exposed to more, there is a little more disease risk attached to those. If you're bringing, in particular, older birds onto your farm or to your property, quarantine or isolate them for at least 21 days, and then observe them for signs of disease. Even if they seem healthy when you're bringing them in, sometimes that stress of being moved will, they'll start to show signs of something that they've been harboring, and that they seemed healthy, but they're actually not as healthy as you thought they might have been. Reintroduced birds are also a risk. So, if you have 4-H birds and you're bringing them back to your flock, or you've gone to a bird show, an exhibition, certainly they've potentially been exposed to something. So you should always quarantine those before you mix them back into your flock. Also consider birds that escape. They've now been exposed to something that you can't control. So, if you have an escapee that's you've caught and brought back, it's always good to quarantine that bird before you mix them back in. Should always quarantine sick birds. If you have any sick birds in your flock, separate them out. And the quarantine should be completely separated. So birds should not be able to touch each other through mesh or wire, or through a pen, through the part of the enclosure. That's not fully quarantined. If you can have separate airspace altogether, then that would be most recommended. And tend to those birds last. So different clothes, different footwear, and deal with them with different equipment. Improve your mortality daily. If in a smaller flock, you're probably not getting a lot of mortality. If you're raising meat birds for your family or whatnot, then you probably will see a little bit more. And dispose of them properly. So mortality that's not disposed of properly can actually attract scavengers and wild birds to your property, and so then you've got wild birds that may carry disease with them. And as well, if you do have something in your flock and you haven't disposed of your mortality properly, if you can see the eagle on the bottom that's carrying the chicken away, you can spread disease from your own flock to somebody else. So always make sure that it's properly disposed of. Wild birds are definitely a hot topic these days, and in particular in presentations like tonight's with the risk of carrying AI. So waterfowl and shorebirds are definitely a high risk, but also migratory birds, non-migratory birds. Pretty much all the wild bird population is a risk to your flock. Spread can happen between wild birds, so the oral fecal route, through predation. So predatory birds that are feeding on other sick birds, and then incidental spread. So there's just contact to contact between birds. So then there's that question, well, we've got all these wild birds, how do I keep them separate from my flock? So physical separation is your best route. It carries the least amount of risk. So if you can, house them indoors, particularly during high risk times like when there is an AI outbreak or during peak migratory seasons. Preventing access, so things like netting and fencing around the birds. Overhead netting, and in particular, that would keep birds that are in flight from defecating into the pen. And make sure the housing structure is in good shape, so those starlings can't wiggle their way in and get into your pen and get at the feed, but present that disease risk. So overhead netting or a tarp, it's minimize the ability to perch above the pen. So if it is open through the top, make sure that there's nowhere that the birds are going to be able to perch on top. So trim branches away. Decrease attractants, so prevent standing water. Standing water is going to draw those wild birds in. Obviously, if it's a pond or a water course, that's a whole different situation, and that's not something you're going to be able to prevent. But if you've got spots that do tend to hold water, grading, drainage, bring fill in, something like that to try to minimize the humps and hollows that end up in standing water. If it's not possible to prevent it, you can fence off air access to that standing water area so your flock can't access it. Minimize debris and vegetation, and again, manage mortality so that you're not drawing birds with that. And then keep your feed and water inaccessible. So it's indoors and it's undercover. The wild birds are not being drawn by your feed storage or your feeders. You can use deterrents like gas or propane cannons, air horns, or distress calls. They can be fairly expensive. A lot of those the wild birds will get used to very quickly, and actually you may end up stressing your own birds out, which is particularly if you're producing eggs or you're producing meat birds. You can actually cause carcass damage or drop egg production by stressing your poultry out. Predator decoys, flags, reflective tape, balloons, those are all things that you can try to deter wild birds. And then motion activated water cannons or sprinklers as well. And also the habitat modification. So you're looking to alter the landscape to decrease how attractive it is to the wild birds or the waterfowl. So decreasing any food source that they're finding attractive, and keeping an eye for nesting area behaviors. So you're actually wanting to disturb them before, say, the waterfowl or geese will start nesting. Once they do start nesting, it's a whole lot harder to deter them. The last three really are probably more, I guess those next two are more for geese. So reducing sight lines to the foraging areas. They require quite a long sight line for landing and takeoff. And they do prefer shorter vegetation. And then reducing the palatability of the forage around the barns, so you're not drawing them. Some of the challenge with this is that you get into different species of wild birds, and while some prefer one type of landscape, you might alter that to deter them. Another type is going to prefer something different, and so by altering it, you actually attract perhaps a different wild bird. So look at what wild birds you do have, and then alter it to deter that specific one. Just a note for those of you that do have meat birds that you're getting from your farm stores. When you do bring those to market, make sure that the crates you're using are clean, and make sure that you can clean and disinfect them both before and after use. Sometimes you go in multiple shipments and you want to make sure that what you're bringing back to the farm isn't then infecting your birds. And very often we're boring, not everybody has their own crates, so you end up boring maybe from somebody else. So just a note on that, make sure that they're clean and disinfected. And as well, it's highly recommended that you check with your processor, to make sure that they have processing space for your birds. It's fall or processing season is a busy time of year, and just a note with them to make sure that you are in their schedule well in advance, and that's not a week or two. When you get your chicks is not too soon to book your slaughter. Also double check on what their protocols are this year. Certainly we're seeing, everybody's increasing their level of biosecurity and changing some of their protocols. So check with your processor to see what they need from you, and what they require for, drop off and in and outs and whatnot. Just a note about a resource that we developed. We developed biosecurity self-assessment, sort of a checklist. I've got one page here. It's actually a 2-page document. It's important to understand how disease spreads and know where your risks are. And it helps you make changes that can help protect your flocks. If you Google poultry biosecurity self-assessment, you'll probably come up with several different resources. This is our version of sort of a Nova Scotia version that we pulled together. And you can find that on the Biosecurity Nova Scotia website, and it's under the checklist section in the livestock area. If you have trouble locating it, certainly reach out, and so we can get that to you. And just a couple slides with take-home messages for you. What we touched on tonight is really the biosecurity basics. There's a lot of information here, and hopefully you can take something away that you can apply to your own place in your own flock. But biosecurity needs to be something that's just part of what we do. And it's all about our attitude as we approach it, that this is something that's important to us, and it does make a difference for the health of your flock. It may look different for different situations. So how you apply biosecurity may be different than your friend who has a flock down the road. But the key is, don't walk disease into your barn, and be extra careful during those high-risk times. And then just that last note, identify where your risks are. Take a really close look, do the self-assessment, and think about how can disease enter and leave your barn, and how can you best protect your flock.
Now,
and with that,
through the questions that we had on the screen, appreciate all three of our speakers. I'd like to thank you for your presentations and sharing with us the information. I'd like to thank all the attendees who put their questions in. Again, we'll go through the video and it will be on the website. We'll say soon, but look for it next week. And if you have questions, please contact your county office and we'll go from there. So any closing remarks from the speakers?
I'd just like to say thanks everyone for attending. It's good to see that you have interest and concern about avian influenza, and hopefully this is helping you to keep your birds safe this summer.
Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.